Okay, great. I'm going ahead and starting the recording.
Um, so the one of the issues here is nobody has produced what you might call a breakdown into modules of the problem, okay? But for example, the problem of monitoring and alarming when volume is too high or too low or respiratory rate is too low, et cetera, can in some senses be separated from the problem of producing sufficient pressure to perform the function, okay? And so I am not building a ventilator. I looked at all these ventilator projects and I was like, as I'm sure you guys feel the same way, there are too many ventilator projects and there's too much duplication of effort. So I focused on testing, and testing is closely related to monitoring, right? Monitoring is what you do when a patient is hooked up. Testing is what you do ahead of time to decide a system. So that's one thing I just wanted you guys to be aware of. This is not a ventilator, and I don't know how successful I'm going to be with it. But the idea here would be other teams could take this and use it as a monitoring solution or use it as a testing solution, okay? And the University of Florida system is on my list. It's impossible for me to keep it up to date all the time. With many of these open source projects, the biggest gap is that, frankly, they haven't thought about testing, but they also haven't developed to the point of doing testing and doing reliability testing. Now, if the University of Florida system sounds like they've been doing at least some testing. So we created another repo. We're working with some Belgians with a system called Breath of Life. And we took the British spec, the rapidly manufactured ventilation system spec from the British government, which I consider to be the best and most concise specification of what's needed for treating COVID-19 people. And we created a spreadsheet of user tests. Okay, and so the user tests are things that a human being does, like can you figure out how to plug the oxygen hose in? You know, does it have a battery backup? Can you plug it in? Do you know how to turn it on? That kind of stuff. This mostly came from the RMBS spec. And so any team, like the German team or the Florida team or whatever, could at least run through these spreadsheets of tests. Oh, that won't come up. They're in a Google Sheet as well as
okay.
Excel. You know, and this is what I would consider a baseline test, right? It's not sufficient. And then you need something like a test lung or my system. You should probably really use both for that. So let me finish now. I don't want to monopolize this conversation, but I wanted to make you aware that there's a separate effort to keep a list of sensors. And I agree, the key to increasing collaboration is going to be modularity in some ways.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I know that Tim on the chat here mentioned that he wanted to speak a little bit about modularization. Timothy Arts, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hey. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, thank you. And if you want to, you can screen share as well.
Yeah, I don't got anything on my screen that's relevant right now. I'm from Help for Engineering. We are a kind of swarm-based engineering team. We've got about 3,000 volunteers right now working on this on various projects. We currently have about 10 ventilator projects with different technologies going. And as to modularization, we are definitely working on that because we have so many different projects going. We have a sensor package and that we have a separate sensor package system as well as some other passively censored systems, one of them based on the Fortran older pneumatic design. And so we are definitely working on separating out the parts and collaborating even just internally with each other on our various ventilator projects. We have a couple, I think 3 now, Ambu Bag projects, and we are getting going on testing there. One thing we are concerned with that we would love to see if there's any other groups doing would be just some fatigue testing of the Ambu Bag themselves. I don't know if we have an example yet of Ambu Bags being cycled for 600,000 or 400,000 or whatever it's, because according to the British spec, we're looking at 400,000 cycles for the ventilator for continuous use. So that's a lot of cycles, and and with the hyperelastic material of the Ambu Bag, we're not sure it can handle that. And we'd be interested if there's anyone out there who could start performing or would perform fatigue testing with Ambu Bags, maybe even with different pressors, squeezers, whatever you want to call it. And we're planning on doing this internally, but as long as we're doing collaboration, I'd love to hear if anyone else has been doing that kind of fatigue testing on the Ambu Bags. Another concern we have is motors. Right now, we're just oversizing stuff for our vents that use motors or steppers, and getting some sort of consensus on motor requirements across these ventilators, especially with regards to heat. That's a concern I think we're going to see a lot of. I know there are some teams that aren't even using motors because of the concerns with high oxygen environments. And so I'd love to hear people's thoughts on motor selection, on Ambu Bag fatigue. And thanks for this call together.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Would somebody like to chime in on the first item, which is the Ambu Bag fatigue, and then we'll go to the next item of motor selection?
Hi, yeah, this is Rob Reed again. I don't know anything about Ambu Bag fatigue, but if we think about an overall process, in that vent monitor project down low, I have a strategy for how teams could cooperate. And, you know, what I propose, which is probably similar to what you guys are thinking, would be that, let's say, the helpful engineering guys, you know, get a system, or the University of Florida people get a system. You know, another team attempts to build it from the designs as quickly as possible to distribute the test effort. And also because no team can really be trusted, because everybody wants their solution to, you know, be successful. So they may inflate the performance of their system in some way. So what we really should do as a community is organize independent test and build teams. And by build, I mean prototype, not manufacture. It's nice to have a manufacturer on the call here, you know. And so the process would be someone proposes a design, another person builds it. If it tests with, you know, one tester, and what I would like to do is to coordinate getting that machine to someone who has sophisticated test equipment, or giving the test equipment to the person who has the machine, you know, to test it for 48 hours in a standardized way. Then, you know, we could have a document that said, well, look, this has been tested. It meets the spec. We want a donor to put up $500,000 and a manufacturing firm to review the plans, which have already been built once, you know, to say, can we establish a line which will make 100 or 500 or whatever of these? And so there's a diagram of that process on my website. Thank you.
Thank you. So for somebody that's working right now on a specific device, what is your take on what Robert just shared in terms of, you know, this testing process or methodology, and also you know, conducting the independent tests? Is anybody on that would like to share?
I'll guess we'll come up with your offer for independent testing. We have some. We actually have 2 people in the team who have testing machines. One associated, I think, with the University of Leipzig has a Draeger 900 testing machine. Looks as if it was from the 80s, 90s from the design. We have someone at the Technical University in Ulm. They built their own testing machine some time ago. And as soon as we have designs that we think are ready to be tested, we will ship them to them or bring them to them for testing. I guess that maybe within this week, in the early next week, to see and review. And then, of course, we publish the designs usually on our GitHub, and then should be able to would invite outside people to do independent testing and production. I mean, there is always this question: do you actually test a design as a concept, or do you actually test what has been manufactured by a specific person, by a specific manufacturer in a specific process, and then see if that actually works? That would be something else and something more that I don't, would need some more capacity to do actually.
Great, thank you. Is there anybody else that would like to provide some comments here regarding testing?
Yeah, Emilio.
This is Rob Kirby, right?
Yeah, yes.
Great.
I guess to the end of a couple of comments. The modular concept, I think, is an excellent one. That's kind of what we were thinking originally as well. As far as the testing goes, basically, you could use remote linking. I mean, I guess I had been sitting back waiting. I mean, we're more on the, I guess, on the product rollout side or manufacturing. And so obviously you've got to determine a design first before you can get to that point. But I guess I would suggest everything I've heard from Robert sounds spot on. I mean, there are, and I did have some slides, but I don't think we've pretty well covered a lot of that material. To the modular concept, I did have one, slide that kind of illustrated that, but Robert put one up that showed a basic ventilator design. So once you get the computer controls on there, obviously those can be streamed live to a team or to anybody that wanted to log in and watch the, see the test in process, at least what the readouts are showing from the sensors. So obviously, if you start seeing volumes drop and pressures indicate the bag's failing, well then you don't need a report. At that point, basically, you would know. So I guess that's pretty much it, Emilio. I mean, I just want to suggest, and I'll leave it at that. Once we get a design, we need to get parts identified, because nobody's going to accept a product that's running a toy computer board or something like that. You're going to have a board that's assembled with some QA. And I know most people on here know that. I'm not opposed to the prototypes running those. Obviously, that's an inexpensive way to get the mechanical design thrashed out, but we got to get past that. I mean, my view is everybody's working on the mechanical side. That's kind of the easy thing that anybody can do that has software to draw drawings up and has a mechanical aptitude. But to get the product out, we got to get past that to the testing and basically the build material. And
thank you. Great. So does anybody else have any inputs on this item regarding testing? No? Okay, so motor selection. That was something that was brought up. Any comments on motor selection? Sounds like somebody.
Well, I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense to ask the question of motor selection, because there may be different designs that have different requirements, right? There's not going to be a single motor that solves the problem. And one of the problems that we may face is a limitation in our supply chain as well, if we're really trying to build 1 million of these. And so, that's why I think an open source design that allows components to be swapped out if necessary, if only because of supply chain operation, and sufficient testing that you can be aware that a slightly different motor is not going to change the performance of the machine, is the right way to solve that problem.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just comment. I mean, most of the designs out there, for those familiar with mechanical designs, are stepper or gear, what they call gear motor, with a Hall effect switch, so that you can control how far the motor moves, which would control the volume and the rate. I haven't seen any that run a continuous one direction motor, although that design would be possible, but that design wouldn't, you couldn't switch a gear motor in place of a continuous motor. So as far as motor selection, I guess Robert's comment's fairly valid. I don't know that we could, limit anybody, but every one I've looked at basically was a Hall effect or some gear motor that could reverse polarity and reverse direction and move in a controlled manner, controlled by a computer circuit. And that's, I think,
okay,
pretty. I think that's maybe as far as you have to go on motor selection. I would suggest we look at other options for those who feel inclined, because you're going to run out of those motors very quickly, and the boards to control them.
Yes, somebody else has a comment there. Is that Sebastian?
As we are looking at different systems, we have different motors. One of the systems currently apparently mass produced in Spain uses a wind swiper motor. And apparently they seem to regulate the amount of pressure and time with a fairly simple mechanical sort of wheel-shaped device. So I'm sort of lacking the English terminology for that. The other stuff people were trying out here are either stepper motors of different size. And I'm not sure, we also have the pump design. I'm not sure what kind of motor that actually uses. I would have to ask the people in the channel to explain that to me.
Okay, great. I see that Brett mentioned, made a comment here about the University of Florida design not requiring a motor. Brett, would you like to elaborate on that?
Group, please understand, I'm not a medical person and I know very little about it, but what I can see about their design, it uses a valve, and there is compressed gas. I assume it's oxygen that's being delivered into a valve, and they're simply operating a valve. Other than that, you'll have to check their website and their documents for more information. Again, we normally build drones, and we're eager to build something to help the world here.
Thank you, Brett. Much appreciated. So I'll go ahead. We have about 20 minutes left on this call. So let's see if we can cover some other topics here that maybe we haven't really covered. This is a discussion list. This is not meant to be exhaustive. So does anybody have any major announcement that they would like to make about a project that hasn't been mentioned here? I'm talking something major, like you're like, wow, like we were able to start testing on animals all of a sudden, and things are looking very well, or human testing or government approvals that are advancing significantly. Wait a second here. Please feel free to add it on the chat or say it verbally. Okay, nothing. Okay, so does anybody need some, and I know some of it was already mentioned here in this call, design or engineering support for your current project? Have you been struggling to fill some area of expertise so you can move along in your project? Nope. Okay. How about for receiving government approvals? Does anybody want to talk about challenges that they faced initially in the process and what they overcame?
I presume most projects are actually quite far away from the stage of government approval. I don't think we are near that right now.
Okay, and that's what seems to be the case. So what have you heard so far about the interest from governments regarding these open source projects for these emergency ventilators? Because I know that there's a lot of activity, a lot of people trying to create them. But
so I'd like to speak to this from the United States point of view.
Okay.
The FDA doesn't actually approve the performance of a ventilator. It has a bunch of tests like you can't have toxic plastic in it and stuff like that. But they don't really test therapeutically that you do something. It's up to the manufacturers to prove that their design is safe and submit that to the FDA. So as the other gentleman speaking said, a fairly extensive testing program has to precede government approval. Now, I've been talking to some pretty frantic people who claim to be connected to the mayor's office in NYC, and they're not asking about approvals. They're just want something as soon as possible, and they'll worry about approvals later because, you know, people are going to die if they don't get ventilation. So in my mind, the real question is, how do you convince a hospital administrator that your machine is going to actually be safe and help keep someone alive? Not, do you have governmental approval on this?
Okay, and what have you heard in terms of the legal liability for these efforts?
The FDA has mentioned, so I'm only speaking from a U.S. point of view. My apologies to Mr. Mueller. The U.S. FDA has issued guidance that the Good Samaritan laws will be applied here, which means, you know, if you're making a best case effort to try to save somebody's life, you are in theory not liable for the action in question. Now, you know, personally, I suspect when all of this is settled, there are going to be some lawsuits. But, you know, I'm trying to save lives.
Yes, and I think that's the challenge that we have, right? Is that people want to save lives, they want to save them quickly, but there was not a process established to do this in a way that has a significant analytical rigor in testing, right? And that's why I really appreciate what you laid out, Robert, in terms of, you know, making sure that we can have testing and do it quickly so that we do maximize patient safety while operating in an emergency scenario where we want to have things out there as soon as possible. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. So on the manufacturing side, let's see if is there anything that we haven't really covered that's the elephant in the room, so to speak, for manufacturing?
Should I say something about the approval thing?
Yes, please,
from
please
my
do.
point of view, as far as we have been trying to get in, well, we had a call with a company that does approving processes in Europe. They mentioned that this usually takes a year to two and costs in between 300,000 to 1.5 million euros, depending on which market you aim. I think the American market is more expensive than just the European, or if you go developing countries, that's obviously cheaper. As far as I understand, if you use it without approval and you do this as a physician, you bear the responsibility for doing so. That may actually be legal in a case where you will run out of other options. But we haven't, we actually put out a call for lawyers and people advising us on that front to come and help with the project. We've had a letter from a state parliament member to the state minister of economics to actually provide us with some help in that matter. I guess it'll take 3 weeks to answer that letter from the ministry to him, and then we'll hear from that.
Okay, great, thank you. So on the manufacturing side, anything that you want to share, some lesson that you learned that you think folks should hear that maybe they're not, something that's not really being talked about too much for the manufacturers that are on the line? Okay, nothing for now. How about?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Robert.
I have a question for the manufacturers. So, in my opinion, none of the open source designs are really ready to be manufactured in quantity. But in order to get this done as quickly as possible, it'd be nice to know what our production capacity is. Like the guy in, was it Nebraska, you know, how many a week could you make if you had a design that was tested and you had confidence in?
Okay,
Sorry, I was going to type my answer here, but based on the Florida design, we estimate we can probably go right off the get-go 50 a day, maybe ramp that up to a couple hundred a day over a week. So that's our estimate right now.
Okay, and do you mind telling me like how many human beings would be working on that line, so I could compare it with other manufacturers?
Estimate about 10 to 12.
Well, to me, that's very encouraging. I mean, if you could build 50 a day with 10 people, you would not be able to solve the US problem, but 10 companies your size could seriously address the US company, and 30 could maybe supply the worldwide demand. So to me, that's actually somewhat encouraging.
Yeah, the key component there, as it appears, is the design is so simple that we can componentize it and get to work quickly.
great. And one thing that I've noticed when I reach out to a lot of the groups working on these open source projects is that they're hesitant to sharing some of their technical documentation until they've actually conducted more testing. But you know, my company, we design products, like I mentioned in the beginning, we work on the stormwater industry. But when I work with a manufacturer, it takes some time for them to review my design specs. There's usually some back and forth, even if I already finalized it. But what do you have to say about some of these folks having at least some version of their technical documentation available, with a caveat that it's not complete and tested yet, for the purpose of manufacturers getting a general sense of what they're up against to start with? What do you think about front loading that conversation with manufacturers? Or would you rather wait until things are already finalized in order to start that conversation?
I'd like to comment on that. I think it's pretty critical to have those designs up, because that's a prototype design, but to turn it into a manufacturable design, you really need to have the input of the people who are going to be the manufacturers based on what is more manufacturable, and they have the expertise to basically contribute to the designer if he doesn't have that or she doesn't have that expertise. Because at the end of the day, it has to be manufacturable in a reliable manner.
Great, and I agree, and that's why, that's the message that I'm trying to get out to some folks, is that although some of these designs aren't complete yet, it's probably better for them to be willing to share some of their design specs, so manufacturers can even know whether or not they should contact that company or that organization. So
I'd like to give a plus 100 to that statement and point out that I have an openness column in my spreadsheet. And I'd also like to say 3 of the most tested products in America, well, I mean, one is Israeli, the Ambu Vent, the Rice MBV system, and the MIT eVent, all claim to be open source, but as of this moment, they have not opened anything. The MIT system has been tested on pigs. I believe it is better tested than most systems, but it's completely useless to anyone attempting to consider manufacturing, because they haven't published the bag of parts. They haven't even published a draft of the bag of parts. And the same is true of many of the other systems that are far along. They say they're open only in the sense of, we will someday be open. They're not actually open today. And that's a tremendous impediment for trying to plan the supply chain or plan setting up a manufacturing line. So I would ask everybody, whenever you talk to a project, try to do what the master of ceremonies here just said. Get them to open their designs. They can put 50 pages of disclaimers on front of it if they want, but you open your design immediately so that other people, including manufacturers, can get the benefit of planning for it.
Great, thank you. And that, the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I have faced that challenge, right? I have designed products, and in SolidWorks it looks fantastic and beautiful, right? And then all of a sudden I show it to my manufacturer, and he says, well, you know, you might want to change this little thing over here. And changing that little thing actually causes a lot of rework that I could have avoided. So I really appreciate that, you know, that you said that, and I hope that, you know, others that are working on projects can get this, and they understand the need to share things early to help themselves. So let's go to another topic here. We only have 5 minutes left now. There's a topic of distribution. If we want to talk about that for just 1 minute, does anybody have a comment around that?
Let me make one about manufacturing. Right now, we are basically being overrun by companies willing to manufacture. I think it's like 50 plus we have in our spreadsheet right now. And I personally presume some of them quite large, actually, large automobile suppliers and so on. More or less also because they don't have actually any work to do right now and are going into the German term Kurzarbeit, where the government pays for the workers, but they don't actually work. So from my point of view, and they also have large engineering teams around. So from my point of view, how far I can oversee it here, the manufacturing won't be a problem. We will have that running once we have a design that is there out.
Okay, great. So on the distribution front, I'm separating these two topics, and I know some keep them together, but I think distribution is distinct from manufacturing, and it has its own challenges. Anything that somebody wants to talk about in terms of distribution? Maybe groups should understand that they haven't thought about yet, potentially.
I believe in rural America, there are likely to be hotspots which make distribution a problem. Even if the entire US supply is able to meet the demand, there will be local discrepancies. Whether a manufactured, inventoried open source system could be used as an emergency stockpile in those rural areas, I don't know. Finally, let me say, I'm glad Germany may have this under control. The US manufacturers are attempting to ramp up production, but just for me personally, I shudder for the people of India and Africa and the great mega cities of the world where they have 20 million people living in large shanty towns. I think there is no question that those people are going to need the emergency ventilators that we're designing right now.
Probably yes. I guess distribution will work as long as the postal system is working. That's one of the key points. If we have stuff that can be produced locally, that will not be such a huge issue. And you can also think out in case you can also shift patients around. That is what, to a limited extent, France and Germany and also Italy have been doing with med-evac flights, with repurposed high-speed trains in normal ambulances. And that is something you can actually do between harder hit and lesser hit regions and buy yourself some time. It has not been done to the extent in Europe, across European borders, that would have been possible and maybe should have been possible. But at least I see it's apparently starting right now.
Great, thank you, thank you. So I'll go ahead and go to the next slide now. We have a couple of minutes on this call. Some quick updates here. Yeah, I've committed for the next several days to have one call per day, starting at the same time, to have these types of discussions. The reason is because things are moving quickly. I understand that not every call will have the same amount of engagement, but I think that we have had a very productive conversation in this call, and we have recorded some of it. I should have recorded it from the beginning. That was my fault, but I will upload this video on our site, and and share a link to this to this recording. Also remember, we have a Slack channel. If you would like to collaborate there, feel free to join our newsletter and add any updates via our website if you would like. I know that there's an exhaustive list of different projects that Robert has created, which is amazing, by the way, Robert. I have to say, this is Robert Reed. And I actually did see your list at some point, and I've been trying to incorporate some of those items here as well. And if you would like to add more projects or submit them via our website, remember, you can do that on our website. You can also add information for suppliers and vendors. It sounds to me like we'll have to add a few more categories here. For example, attorneys, because it sounds like the legal side of things might have some importance in this, and it will accelerate as these projects advance. And then also the government contacts. We may eventually also add information here or a link for people that are interested in participating in trials for these different products, and also testing, which might go under the suppliers and vendor side of things, and eventually use of this. So we can understand the demand a little bit better, because we are assuming, I think, a lot of things right now in terms of demand, and especially with third world countries, but we're not really sure yet. So it might be good to have a better sense of that. Would somebody like to comment on these items before we end the call?
Yeah, Emilio, I'd like to thank you for doing that. One thing that I am not going to do is I'm not going to take on matching suppliers and vendors. I've got plenty of other stuff to do. So if your group could focus on, pushing teams to get a bag of parts that allows you to talk about supply chain issues and vendors and stuff, basically you could be the kind of source to go to when you're getting closer to manufacturing, and I can be the source when you're closer to needing testing stuff.
I like that. I like that very much, because as you said in the beginning, we don't want to duplicate efforts, right? We don't have the time for that, honestly. So
right.
I would like to focus where I can add the most value. And it sounds like you have already put a lot of thought and into the area of testing and validation of results. So that sounds great. I can connect with you offline on that. And I'll definitely keep that into consideration here for us to narrow or focus a little bit, and be able to move along those fronts once people are past a certain phase. Any other last minute comments? We're already a couple of minutes over.
If Robert could, I have a look at Robert's comments and we'll forward them to our teams, and they will, I guess, they'll be very helpful.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Any other last minute comments? No, okay. If you have any additional contacts, please share them on the chat here. You can share your email address or other links and documents. We're gonna go ahead and close up this call. Remember, if you share anything here, this video is being recorded. We will share everything as publicly as possible, so please keep that in mind. If you want to share your own contact information, please go ahead and put it there. I see Robert Reed, you already added yours. Thank you very much. But that concludes the call. Thank you everybody for joining. And again, we'll have the next call tomorrow. Please feel free to share the link to the website that you see above. And I'm looking forward to much success with these projects and helping to save lives. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll keep this open just for a second in case somebody would like to add things on the chat. But this meeting has officially ended. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now. And Brett, thank you. You'd like to see a bit more discussion in the future of who is a customer? Okay, that is good, Brett. I appreciate that. I'll make sure that we include that in future discussions. We'll also start reaching out to gauge the actual demand as well. If there are any other comments, please add them on the chat now, because I'm about to stop sharing the screen and recording, and I'll end the meeting in just a minute. Okay, I see there's no more activity on the chat. Thank you, everybody. The meeting will end now.